Hi, I'm Rebecca Hamilton with Key Ministry,
And I'm Katie Wetherbee with Key Ministry.
and we're going to talk today about building bridges and how to successfully advocate for your child in the church setting. And as Katie mentioned, she is with Key Ministry as Director of Training and Education, and she also wears another hat as an educational advocate, but she sort of shies away from using that term, educational advocate. Katie, why don't you tell us why that is?
Well, I think advocacy has gotten a really negative connotation over the last few years. So often, I think in the media, parents are sort of conditioned to be ready for a fight when they go in to work with the school and advocate for their children. And things can become acrimonious very, very quickly. And I think that that is just tremendously sad. So I really do shy away from using the term advocate, because when I go into a school and say that I'm an advocate, it immediately sort of puts the school folks on edge. I would much prefer to say that I'm helping the parent or I'm consulting with the parent, and I'm here to help everybody. A lot of times people say, well, I don't get it, who's your client, the parents or the school? And I always say the child is the primary client, because we all want what's best for the child.
Yeah. How did you first become interested in advocating for kids?
Well, I taught special education for a long time and then had babies and stopped teaching full time. And then as life would have it, I have a daughter who got really sick and had a stroke when she was 4, and so suddenly I was thrust out of that teacher chair and into the parent chair. And once she was out of the hospital and doing better, I had to deal with the school piece of her recovery, and I soon learned that it was really hard to advocate for my own kid. I kept thinking, well, once I get her well enough and get her to school, then I'll be fine. That's the part I know because I was a teacher. But I learned that when your mother hat is on, no other hat fits. And as I began working with the school and making mistakes and doing some things well and some things not so well, I realized that other parents needed this kind of support as well. So along with my business partner, I started doing educational consulting.
When a parent thinks about advocating for their child at church, where do you think they should start?
Well, it's a good question, because churches don't necessarily operate the same way as schools do. And I think in many ways, though, we've got to start in a similar way that we would start at school, and that's with, talking a little bit about what you want the child or what the parent wants the child to be able to do by the end of the next year. Parents are very used to that when it comes to doing planning, but we don't often take time to do planning for a child's spiritual growth. I remember meeting with one of our daughter's doctors, and he said, well, what are your plans for your daughter? And I just was so overwhelmed by that question, I didn't know what to say. And he said, your job as a mom is to dream big, but plan annually. Take each year and try to get the most out of it, and then reevaluate for the next year. And that's really what I encourage parents to do, not only at school, but at church as well. We've developed a form through Key Ministry called the GROW Plan, and GROW is an acronym that stands for how you want your child to grow in his or her relationship with God, and R is relationships with others, O is an ability to do outreach, and W is understanding and participating in worship. And I encourage parents to think through all of those things so that you know that by the end of the year, sort of where you want that child to be.
What are the biggest differences between advocating at school and advocating at church for your child?
Well, advocating at school comes with a lot of legal rules. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Those are all governing the kinds of services and supports and accommodations that kids get. Those don't necessarily apply at church. We're not an educational institution that's getting funding from the government. And while new churches do have to be accessible to families physically, churches aren't necessarily bound to providing services and accommodations the same way that schools are. And that's okay, because the church is serving a different purpose. So I like to look at it through God's eyes and try to see what He would want. And the best place, I think, to rest is knowing that we are charged by the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel to everyone, and that includes kids with disabilities. We also know that the church is incomplete without the gifts of everyone. So we want kids and families affected by disabilities in our church, and Jesus said, the bottom line, let the little children come to me. And I love when you're teaching workshops, Rebecca, you always say, he didn't say let the well-behaved children come to me, or the children who have not had diseases, or the children who don't have learning disabilities, or the ones that can sit still. He said all of the children. So those are some pretty good rules to go by, I think.
If a family is out looking for a new church home, what are some of the things that they should consider as they look around at prospective churches?
That's a good question. I think it's important to check websites and to see if there's any mention on the church's website about understanding special needs or having a program or support in place. That can be a little bit of a clue that the church knows a little bit. It doesn't tell you if it's the right fit, but at least you'll know a little bit about it. I also encourage parents, when they're able, to visit the church without the kids, to take in a Sunday service or an evening service and see how it's structured, to look at the kids' programs and get a feel for what that might be like. Some parents don't have the option of doing that, but if they do, that can be a really good idea.
And every parent wants their kids so much to be successful. What can a parent of a child with special needs do in the church setting to set their child up for success?
Well, I think it's important when we talk about advocating in the church to be really honest with the church staff. If you've got a child who has special needs and really is going to require extra support, everybody from the child to the parents to the church staff and volunteers, everyone does best when they've got all of the information. So making an appointment with a pastor or someone in charge of children's ministry or youth ministry is really important. This is not the kind of conversation that we want to have in the hall on Sunday. That's a work day for pastors. They are very, very busy, and grabbing a pastor by the sleeve and saying, hey, I want to tell you about my child's learning disabilities is probably not the best time for either of you. It's going to be rushed, and you want to have time to sit and reflect. So making that appointment and going in and talking a little bit about the child, having a picture of the child, and explaining a bit. We've got some information on the handouts for this session on writing a document called Introducing My Child, so that the parent can really think through, what are my child's strengths, what are my child's needs, what are the safety issues involved, any dietary restrictions. We've got a whole form that the parent can fill out. It's not long, but it can really go a long way in helping the church to feel set up for success. Another idea in terms of setting up the child for success comes from Mike Woods, who runs a ministry in Florida. I had suggested to Mike one time, having the child visit during the week when the building's quiet and being able to sort of practice church. And he said, gee, I love that idea. He said, but that would not work with my kids. So here's what I've done. And I just love Mike's idea. He went to the church on his own and filmed a whole tour of the Sunday school area, the worship stage, and where the kids would have small groups. And so they watched it, and they watched it, and they watched it, and they watched it. And the kids really sort of got the idea of what church was going to be like and what to expect.
I love that idea. The teams in a school setting have annual meetings between parents and teachers and kids to discuss goals and things like that. Do you think this should be part of the church life as well?
I think it can be, but I think that if we as parents demand that or expect it to be just like school, we sort of run the risk of straining our relationships a little bit. Some churches who have special needs ministries may do that as a matter of course. That may be part of what they offer. Others may not. Sometimes pastors who are in charge of kids have another job. This is not their only job, or just volunteer leaders. And we don't want to stretch them, but we can certainly communicate, hey, these were the best things about the year, and next year I'm hoping my child will be able to learn these things, or we'll be able to try these things. Tell me what you think. It's important that we as parents remember that the relationship with folks at church, with folks at school, with therapists, any of these people in our kids' lives, it's sort of like a bank account, and we need to constantly invest in that relationship so that when things do become difficult, or there's a disagreement, or you do need that extra meeting because maybe the child's transitioning to youth group, that you've invested enough in that relationship that there's something to draw from as well.
Some parents feel it's important for their church to know all about their child's goals and objectives for school. How do you feel about that? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that there are going to be volunteers and church leaders who are interested in that, but I think it's important for parents to remember that the church is not a therapeutic setting. And while it would be great for us to be able to work on IEP goals and objectives, it's not necessarily going to be possible. Volunteers are not going to be giving the same cues and having the same protocol as kids, as teachers and therapists at school, and that's okay. I've known of situations where church staff or volunteers are really interested and they want to be aware so they can set the child up for success. There was one leader who was aware that there was a child having a lot of difficulty participating in conversations and would blurt out answers. And the parent had shared that with the leader, and so what the leader did was take this kid aside and said, okay, you know, I noticed that you're blurting out answers a lot. I want you to maybe be the third or fourth person to call out and see if that works for you. And it was done beautifully. Now, she's not, this youth leader is not a speech therapist or an occupational therapist working on social skills, but she was aware enough to support the goal in a different way. And parents have to remember that that's a good thing too, because we want our kids to be able to generalize from school settings and therapeutic settings to other settings in the community and church.
That's a great point. Church leaders, pastors, volunteers can sometimes be overwhelmed if a parent wants to include their child with special needs in church programming. What can parents do to help ease that tension?
Well, I think part of what we can do is what we've already talked about, is being proactive and giving information and being part of the solution as well, letting the church leaders know that you're ready and willing to help or volunteer. Believe me, I know. I'm a mom of a child who was once in need of a lot of help. I know that the last thing that parents might want to do is volunteer on a Sunday morning, but that investment of time can be very, very helpful in the long run. We've also seen folks run into some snafus with church staff, and you know, I always say that you can build a perfect church, but as soon as you put a person in it, it's not perfect anymore. When frustrated or angry, people are going to say things that they wish that they wouldn't have said. And we had one family that called us and said, you know, they've asked us to teach PSR, which is a Catholic course, to our child at home. They don't want our child to come anymore. Another family who the child was being held by the collar, taken into the fellowship hall, and the volunteer said, "Is this yours?" Just the child had incited a lot of anger that morning, and the volunteer had just really used up every available resource. Those things hurt parents and cause a lot of tears and grief at home. They really do. And they're going to happen. And so I think the best thing for us to do is to anticipate that those things are going to happen, to say, neither one of us should probably talk about this right now. Let me calm down my child, and let's touch base this week. In the heat of the moment, we're probably all likely to say things that we wish we wouldn't have said. It's okay to express frustration and disappointment that something's not working, and disagreement about how something was happening. But we need to speak the truth in love. And that's where advocacy can really model a Christ-like behavior. As much as we're hurting as parents, as much as it's so hard and we don't want to have to explain our child one more time. Barb Dittrich, our colleague from Wisconsin, always said, this is an opportunity for you to be the light of Christ.
And a lot of times, you've mentioned some examples of when things aren't going so well in the church setting, but a lot of times things go really, really well in the church setting. What do we do then?
We capitalize on those times and we recognize them and we celebrate them and we are thankful. We have to remember that volunteers and pastors work really, really hard. And a word of kindness that encourages them can go a long way in building that relationship. So noticing that something's going well, telling the senior pastor, hey, the children's pastor just went above and beyond and my child is having so much fun. And copying that children's pastor so that they know that something nice was said about them.
That's a great idea.
Is really important. Everybody likes to be recognized. And
Absolutely.
I think just to backtrack a little bit, one thing I also want to mention is that we as parents need to be careful. You know, we talked about a couple of communication snafus that that happen from the church side of things, but we've got to be careful as parents not to be asking things that are not really the church's role. I've had parents say to church staff, well, I want someone to spend quality time with my child and build into him. Well, that's a parent's role too. So asking, how can I fortify my child? But asking someone else to parent your child, that's not okay.
It's a great point. Future planning is really important for any family, but we really want to focus on how can families and churches work together for the long haul for kids with special needs. So how do you recommend that parents proceed for the long haul?
Well, I think it's important to look at your next big transition, and this is true in school as well as at church. I always tell parents, when you're planning for your child, get the most out of the next year in preparation for that next transition. So if your child is a first grader, you want to get that child ready for maybe Club 56, or you want to get your child ready for the transition to the middle school. And the same is true when we talk about church. Building relationships with those next group of leaders, that's going to be really, really important. And documenting what has gone well can also be very, very helpful, so that when you sit down with the group of leaders that is going to be receiving your child, you've got some good documentation about what works, and it's going to be a little bit less overwhelming for that receiving team. And it is then a process of building relationships all over again. We have another form available that parents and Sunday school staff can fill out together, or youth staff, that talks a little bit about transitioning kids and what works, and sort of gives a one-page summary of a child's strengths and needs, which can be really helpful. And if people are interested in that, they can get it from our website.
Okay. What if a church just doesn't work out for a family?
You know, that happens, and it's hard, and that's not something anyone wants to go through, especially when a parent and a family has invested time in trying to make it work. I had a wonderful pastor's wife tell me one time, she was raising a child with autism, and she said, you know, sometimes things just don't work out, but you have to remember that the folks that you're working with, even if you don't agree, even if you're not seeing eye to eye, they're children of God too. And it's just not a good fit, and you've got to let it go. That was kind of a bitter pill for me to swallow in the situation that I was in. But I'm glad I did, because it gave me peace to go forward. And then I remember her husband saying, it's not that you're leaving church with the capital C, you're just finding what part of the vineyard you're supposed to be tending. We have to remember that the church is not one building, it's not one place, and sometimes it does take time to figure out the right spot that God wants our family to be.
I like how you said a right fit, and it really is just a fit between the family and the church. Do you think effective inclusion means that every child will be included in every activity?
I don't. I really don't, and I think that's important to talk about, because sometimes when parents come to the church and say, you know, this is my child's need, but I want him or her to be able to go on every retreat and to be able to do every activity, sometimes that's just not the right fit. We talk in schools about least restrictive environment. being the appropriate placement for a child. And when we talk about that, that could mean anything from being in the regular classroom included all of the time to being in a separate school. It's different for every child. I tell people it's sort of like choosing a pair of pants. You don't want them too tight and you don't want them too loose. So that, I think, is very wise for church as well. Sometimes kids are not going to be able to do every activity every time. And it really takes good communication to figure out what that right fit is. We had a delightful family and a delightful child who did very well in his lesson time at Sunday school, but when it came time for the game time of the day, he really fell apart. He was very impulsive, and he got out of control. It was just not the right fit. And what the team and the family decided together is that he would have his lesson, and then he would put on an orange parking vest and head out to the parking lot, and he helped direct traffic with supervision, along with some adults. And I commented to his mom one time, I said, it's such a joy to come into the parking lot because there he is smiling at me. And she said, well, that's his ministry, is welcoming people to the church. It was such a great fit. So the family was willing to look at things differently and find an area where he could serve and give joy to other people. And that, to me, is effective inclusion.
Thank you, Katie. Well, thanks for being with us today. We hope this was a helpful session for you. If you have questions or want to follow up in any way, you can always touch base with us through the Key Ministry website, which is www.keyministry.org, and we hope to hear from you soon. God bless.